For more than a century, Spinosaurus was a ghost stitched together from scraps, a towering T-Rex-like killer topped with a dramatic sail. Textbooks, toys, even movies sold us that image. But as new fossils surfaced and old assumptions crumbled, a very different creature emerged, river-haunting, fish-hunting, and stranger than anything we'd imagined. This is the story of how we got Spinosaurus wrong, and how science put it back together again. We didn't just misunderstand Spinosaurus. We authored a character and cast it in a story we already liked. Picture the early 20th century, a handful of bones pulled from sun-baked rock, a few odd vertebrae with spines like ship masts, teeth that said meat, and a scientific culture freshly enamoured with giant two-legged killers. What do you do with a creature that refuses to be neat? You tidy it. You stand it upright. You give it the legs and swagger of a land tyrant. You let the sail be a dramatic flourish, like a villain's cape, and you call it a day. The silhouette looked right on a museum wall and on a toy shelf, and for a surprisingly long time, looking right did most of the work. The truth is, our brains prefer templates. In paleontology, the template for big carnivores was simple: deep-chested, barrel-bodied, thick tail for counterbalance, slicing teeth, long strides across dry ground. Drop the new bones into the mould, smooth the edges, and you've got a crowd pleaser. Spinosaurus became T-Rex with a billboard, because the alternative, a crocodile-faced river-haunting specialist, didn't fit the mental furniture we'd arranged for dinosaurs. We filled gaps with familiarity, and familiarity wears a convincing mask. Missing evidence didn't help. So much of the early material was fragmentary, part of a skull here, a handful of vertebrae there, a few limb bits you couldn't quite reconcile with the rest. Then history intervened, and much of the crucial reference material was lost. Imagine writing a novel where the first chapter burns, and the rest of the book is scattered across attics. You'd lean harder on rumour and memory. That's what happened to Spinosaurus. Reconstructions copied reconstructions, each one tracing the lines of the last, the way a faded photocopy inherits every smudge. Over time, the copy started to feel like the original. Popular culture locked the image in place. Dinosaurs became blockbuster characters, and characters need clear shapes. The runner, the slasher, the sprinter over sand dunes. A sailback predator towering over the desert is a clean, thrilling idea. It photographs well. It animates well. It sells. Once an image hardens in the public imagination, it becomes the default reference, even for experts, because we're all swimming in the same cultural water. Ask a child to draw Spinosaurus 20 years ago and you'd get the same pose every time. Mouth agape, tail out for balance, sail like a knife through the sky. No rivers, no reeds, no fish scale shimmer. Just a monster we already understood. And yet the bones kept whispering contradictions. Conical teeth aren't steak knives. They're grips, better for holding slippery prey than for sawing flesh. The snout proportions hinted at something more crocodilian than tyrannosaurian. But when you've built a towering sprinter in your mind, those clues feel like footnotes, not headlines. We cherry-picked the features that supported the land predator fantasy and treated the rest as quirks. One tooth doesn't overturn a legend. A few unusual vertebrae don't move a giant. Even posture was a story we told ourselves. For decades, large theropods were drawn too upright, with tails dragging like anchors. That posture bled into Spinosaurus art by inertia. Stand it tall, plant it wide, let the sail rise like a banner over a battlefield. Hands were often illustrated in impossible inward-facing positions because the predator's clutch looked dynamic. We interpreted every uncertain line through the lens of drama. If you were designing a movie poster, you couldn't have done better. Bias did the rest. Quiet, respectable bias. Confirmation bias, we noticed what fit the script. Anchoring, the first popular reconstruction set the boundary posts. Aesthetics bias, elegant silhouettes felt truer than awkward ones, and a big one, terrestrial bias. Dinosaurs, we assumed, dominated land. Specialization for water. That sounded like a demotion, not a revelation. No one wants their apex monster to turn into a weird fisherman, so the fisherman kept being repainted as a land tyrant with a quirky fashion sense. There's also the problem of empty space. The fossil record leaves holes. Our minds hate holes. We patched them with analogies from animals we knew: wolves, big cats, tyrannosaurs. Imagine being handed a few puzzle pieces from a dragonfly and a trout and being told to finish the picture. If all you own are puzzles of horses, you'll force the pieces into a horse. They won't click, but from far away it still looks like an animal. That's what our early Spinosaurus looked like. Something that held together until you examine the seams. The sail especially invited projection. Was it for display, heat regulation, species recognition, intimidation? Those debates were real, but in popular reconstructions the sail often acted like a story device. It made Spinosaurus look more exotic without changing the underlying animal. You could bolt a dramatic sail onto a standard theropod and call it new. That design trick satisfied the hunger for novelty, while protecting the comfort of the familiar. We invented a monster that was safely strange. It didn't help that the deserts where some remains were found seemed to corroborate the sprinting over sand image. We forget that landscapes move through deep time. Today's dunes can hide yesterday's riverbeds. But the camera loves dunes, vast empty stages for chases and battles, so the desert stuck to Spinosaurus like a costume. We set it running across a stage that didn't even exist when it lived. What's striking in hindsight is how patiently the real animal waited under our assumptions. The clues were not tiny: conical teeth by the handful, jaw grooves suggestive of pressure sensing, limb proportions hinting that land speed wasn't the priority we thought. But ideas have momentum, and momentum is a kind of blindness. As long as the invented monster kept performing, roaring, sprinting, triumphing, we had little incentive to rewrite its lines. And then there's pride. Scientists are human, and humans like being right. Once a model settles into textbooks, it gains a halo of authority. Changing it feels like undoing part of the order we've worked so hard to build. So we domesticated the uncomfortable data, smoothing it into our preferred vision. We didn't lie, we rationalized. We told ourselves the evidence was ambiguous, and it was. But ambiguity should slow us down, not speed us toward the nearest familiar shape. Spinosaurus shows how powerfully a silhouette can govern thought. One shape ruled our ideas for decades: big head, thick neck, deep torso, long legs, balancing tail, billboard sail. That outline became an argument all by itself, a logic without words. Deviate from it, and the creature looked wrong. So we kept drawing it right and thinking it right, until the stack of contrary facts grew too heavy to ignore. If you want a single sentence for how we got here, it's this: we made a gap-filling guess, and then mistook that guess for a fact. From there, culture amplified it, history cemented it, and our cognitive habits defended it. The monster we invented was exciting, marketable, and plausible enough to pass. But it wasn't Spinosaurus. The real animal was waiting in the water, just off stage, while our land-bound imagination thundered past on two legs. The unmasking didn't happen in one dramatic reveal. It came as a slow accumulation of, that's odd moments. A jaw that behaves more like a fishing tool than a bone saw. A body plan that makes more sense slipping through currents than sprinting over sand. A tail that argues with the poster on your childhood wall. Each oddity tugged a thread. Pull enough threads, and the costume began to sag. Underneath, not a desert sprinter with a fancy fin, but something stranger, sleeker, and better tuned to a world of reeds, mud, and glittering scales. In other words, we weren't simply wrong, we were unimaginative. We failed to imagine that a giant theropod could abandon the dry stage and take up a life between worlds. So we wrote it back into the role we'd already cast. Only when the evidence forced our eyes to the water did we let Spinosaurus become what it always was. The monster we invented had to step aside so the animal could finally swim into view. Before we could even argue about what Spinosaurus was, history reached in and stole the reference copy. Ernst Stromer, patient, cautious, almost stubbornly honest, shipped the precious bones from the Egyptian desert to Munich in the early 1900s. He labelled, measured, sketched. He worried over details that other men would have smoothed away. And then, one night in 1944, bombs erased the museum hall where those bones slept. Stone that had survived 100 million years shattered in minutes. The name Spinosaurus aegyptiacus remained in the literature, but the animal itself was reduced to drawings, measurements, and a handful of photographs pinned to a vanished specimen. Paleontology is a science of fragments. Losing the holotype turned the fragment into a rumour. With the original gone, every future fossil had to be compared not to bone but to Stromer's paper ghost. Holotypes are anchors. They let you say, with legal clarity, this is this. Without one, you hold a title deed to a house that burned down. The street address exists and a floor plan, but nobody can walk through the rooms. So the discipline fell back on second-hand certainties, ink lines tracing vertebrae, the ratio of spine height to centrum width. The angle of a jaw preserved only in photographs, 1 degree of distortion away from the truth. Measurements become scripture when the bones are ash. The absence warped practice in subtle ways. When new North African fossils surfaced, isolated teeth, vertebrae, bits of jaw, they arrived like puzzle pieces with no picture on the box. The teeth were unmistakable. Conical, fluted, crocodile-like. But conical teeth alone don't build an animal. Vertebrae with elongated neural spines hinted at a sail. Yes, but sails had appeared in unrelated lineages before. Every piece that looked Spinosaurish was tentatively dragged into the orbit of a missing star. Comparative to Stromer 1915, the caption said, even as the comparison was to a drawing of a bone under wartime lighting. When you cannot verify by touch, you verify by tradition. Then add the chaos of provenance. The Sahara is not a single clean outcrop. It is a patchwork of formations folded and tilted, weathered by wind into a maze of gullies and flats. Fossils erode onto the surface, drift, rebury. Commercial collecting, sometimes careful, sometimes hurried, lifts specimens out of context. A tail from one individual travels a different path than a skull from another. Labels get smudged. Localities are given as chem, when the rocks inside that vast unit are not all the same age or environment. Provenance is half the fossil. Lose it, and even a beautiful bone loses its ability to speak in complete sentences. This is how chimeras happen. Not the mythic creature, but an interpretive one. You find a jaw that fits the Spinosaurid mold. You find vertebrae with absurdly tall spines. You find limb bones that might match, or might belong to a contemporaneous theropod whose name will be published 10 years later. Fit them together, and you can conjure a coherent animal, the way a good storyteller can smooth over plot holes with confidence. For decades, reconstructions of Spinosaurus smuggled in neighbouring dinosaurs to fill gaps left by the bombing of Munich. Not because anyone intended to deceive, but because the data landscape almost demanded it. The pieces wanted to click. Stromer had warned us even then. His field notes, Blessed Survivors, show a man cautious about overreach. He noted the fragility of associations, the way bones lay in the field, the possibility of multiple individuals mingling. Yet notes and photos are polite. Bones are argumentative. Without the original specimen to push back, later workers could bend the paper record to fit new finds. A vertebra drawn from a three-quarter view becomes suspiciously compatible with a bone photographed head-on. A number that once had a margin of error turns, through successive citations, into a fixed law. The more a fact is repeated, the harder it is to remember that it began as a measurement of something that no longer exists. The war's erasure had another effect. It froze the early 20th century moment in amber. Methods that would later become standard, CT scanning, microanatomy, isotopic analysis, finite element modelling, could never be applied to the holotype. The decisive test that might have settled debates before they metastasise was simply impossible, so the argument migrated to safer ground: silhouettes, analogies, and the unspoken authority of consensus. A long spine here, a crocodile-like snout there. Surely the rest was as we imagined. When evidence can't advance, story rushes in to occupy the space. The deserts themselves conspired against clarity. The Bahariya and Kem beds in North Africa, which yield spinosaurid material, are rich in predators and notoriously poor in complete skeletons. The fossil record there behaves like a sandstorm of parts. A tooth from a giant crocodiliform beside a vertebra from a carcharodontosaur beside a fish scale the size of your palm. Imagine a junkyard, endlessly shuffled with model years mixed across decades. You can build a car out of what you find, but it may run on hope more than engineering. That's how Spinosaurus functioned in the literature for a long time, an assemblage that worked well enough to drive the narrative forward. Enter the stand-ins: Baryonyx from England, Suchomimus from Niger, spinosaurids blessed with better preservation. They became tutors to the ghost. Their forelimbs, claws and skulls offered concrete anatomy, where Spinosaurus had only outlines. But borrowing anatomy is not the same as finding it. Every time a feature from a relative was plugged into Spinosaurus, the picture sharpened and blurred at the same time. Yes, you gained plausibility. You also risked smoothing away whatever made Spinosaurus singular within its lineage. The lost bones forced us to speak in the dialect of cousins. Even the simple act of scaling bones, how big was it really, turned slippery. When your yardstick is a photograph of a vertebra with unknown lens distortion, and your comparator is a similar vertebra from a different species, small errors inflate. One reconstruction yields a giant that dwarfs all challengers. Another, using a different set of proxies, produces a more modest beast. Size, that most headline-grabbing of dinosaur facts, meandered through the literature on the back of missing calcium phosphate. The museum loss also rewired the sociology of the subject. Private collectors played a larger role because, in the absence of a definitive public specimen, any promising material felt priceless. Important fossils travelled through hands rather than straight into institutions. Descriptions sometimes preceded exhaustive vetting. Rivalries sharpened. The usual frictions of science, but amplified by scarcity. With so much riding on each new fragment, debates hardened quickly. If you believed a tail was paddle-like, then every ambiguous groove supported your belief. If you believed the animal stayed mostly land-bound, then every robust muscle scar on a limb bone looked like confirmation. The missing holotype became a mirror that reflected back whatever the beholder expected to see. Meanwhile, the technology that might have rescued certainty could only touch the bones we still had. Thin section histology showed unusually dense cortical bone in some spinosaurids, an adaptation that reduces buoyancy. But was that true for Spinosaurus itself, or were we reading the habits of its kin? Stable isotope ratios suggested a heavy aquatic diet in some teeth. But whose teeth? Precisely. The Sahara's mixed faunas mean that a tooth inches away in the ground may belong to an entirely different animal, separated by thousands of years. Context is king. Context, here, is often a rumour. Through all this, Strummer's legacy kept us honest in one crucial way. His meticulous plates and fussed-over captions served as a conscience on paper. He had recorded just enough to stop the wildest flights. We knew the sale was real, not a collector's exaggeration. We knew the teeth were conical and numerous. We knew the snout and nostril placement differed from classic land tyrants. The truth was present as a constellation of facts, but the lines connecting the stars were ours to draw. Some constellations looked like sprinting monsters, others increasingly hinted at something that belonged to water as much as land. If there's a lesson in the vanished bones, It is that absence is an active force. It doesn't simply subtract, it shapes. The bombing didn't just remove evidence, it created decades of inference work that might never have been necessary. It invited composites, relied on relatives, amplified biases, and turned cautious sketches into canonical images. When we finally began to recover more associated material in the 21st century, tails that argued for propulsion, limb proportions that bulked at the old sprinting silhouette, the new bones weren't just data. They were a rebuke to the habits we'd developed in the vacuum left by war. And yet, paradoxically, the loss also taught us discipline. With the most important specimen gone, we had to squeeze meaning from the least glamorous sources, locality notes, sediment samples, micro scratches on enamel, bone density patterns, the company a fossil kept in the rock. We learned to treat a field photograph as a primary text and to admit, out loud, the difference between what the evidence says and what we want it to say. In the end, the vanished holotype made us better readers of the fragments that remained. So the story of Spinosaurus is also the story of how science endures damage. Bones burn, paper survives, drawings guide, new bones correct. In the space between, generations of researchers argue, revise and test, trying to hear the animal through the hiss of missing data. We lost the first voice. It took decades to gather enough echoes to reconstruct the song. At first, the new bones merely nagged at the old picture. A jaw fragment with teeth that weren't blades but cones, polished like pebbles. A snout pocked with tiny openings that looked suspiciously like plumbing for something more than muscle and skin. A nostril set farther back from the tip than a desert sprinter would prefer. Each piece, on its own, could be waved away as an oddity. Together they began to sketch an animal that didn't hunt with speed and slashing, but with steadiness and touch, an animal that could read water. Start with the mouth. The front of the upper jaw flares into a subtle rosette, a widening that creates space for larger interlocking teeth to clamp down on a wriggling body. That geometry isn't for tearing, it's for gripping. Think of a hand adjusting to the curve of a fish. The teeth themselves are round in cross-section, lightly ridged, and lack the serrations that make steaks out of herbivores. Conical teeth spread force evenly and resist the bending that happens when prey thrashes. A blade wants a clean, predictable cut. A cone wants chaos and turns it into control. Layered into the snout is a second sense, a web of neurovascular canals that open as pinprick foramina along the surface. In crocodilians, those paws feed pressure sensors. They feel the tremor of movement through water even in darkness. Spinosaurus's snout tells the same story. The nerves and blood supply that run in those canals support a face built to detect ripples, to orient on disturbances, to strike where eyes alone would fail. This is a hunter that keeps its head low and still, letting the river announce the path to dinner. Then come the nose and the roof of the mouth. The external nares, nostril openings, ride farther back than in land-chasing theropods, tucked away from the splash zone. The palate is reinforced in a way that tolerates torsion, as if the animal expects the prey to twist and spin once trapped. Clamp, twist, hold. The old poster of a running, roaring beast looks less persuasive when the mechanics of its head argue for patience and leverage instead. The rest of the skeleton, where we have it, hums the same aquatic note. Bone cross-sections show density higher than you'd expect for a terrestrial sprinter. Dense bone adds mass without much buoyancy. It's a diver's trick used by hippos and penguins to stay neutral in the water column. Pair that with hind limbs proportionally shorter than you'd script for a pursuit predator, and a centre of mass that drifts forward, and the land runner fades even more. Long, piston-like legs make sense on dirt. In water, they just make drag. Spinosaurus seems to have accepted clumsier strides on land in exchange for control where it mattered. The shallows and channels, and then the tail changed everything. The surprise was not that it was long. That's normal for theropods. but that the neural spines and chevrons ballooned into a tall, flexible blade along much of its length. The structure reads like a fin built for lateral oscillation. Wide surface area to shove against water, interlocking joints to keep the stroke coherent. Enough flexibility to undulate rather than merely wag. Model that shape and it throws water backwards with purpose. A balancing pole becomes a propeller. Limbs that once were penciled in as sprinting supports now look like stabilizers and rudders. Forelimbs with robust claws could rake or pin a struggling fish in the shallows. The feet, broad, with hints that the toe surfaces were suited to soft substrates, would plant better in mud than in scree. Some reconstructions add webbing between toes. Direct soft tissue evidence is absent, but the functional logic is tempting. A paddle needs surface area. Even without webbing, a splayed foot spreads load and resists sinking, turning each step into a careful wade rather than a dash. Context sharpens the picture. The rocks that yield Spinosaurus parts are laced with the remains of giant fish and aquatic reptiles. Saw-toothed Onchopristis rostra like serrated oars. Coelacanth scales big as playing cards. Lungfish burrows. Turtle shells. Crocodile armour. It's a river system fossilised mid-flow. Braided channels. Floodplains. Oxbows. In that neighbourhood, a dinosaur specialised for fish isn't a curiosity. It's an ecological inevitability. You don't bring steak knives to a fish market. You bring a trap and a sense of timing. Diet leaves signatures that bones alone can't fake. Chemistry threaded into tooth enamel, oxygen isotopes and other traces, leans aquatic for spinosaurids, consistent with prey pulled from water rather than land, where patterns on some teeth suggest gripping and release rather than slicing. Micro scratches run in ways more consistent with a coiling fish than a struggling herbivore. Even the company a tooth keeps in the rock matters. If your shed crowns are consistently found amid fish debris, the statistical story you're telling is hard to ignore. So how did this animal hunt? Picture it not as a crocodile clone, but as something that borrows moves from multiple playbooks. In deep, slow channels, the tail sculls in measured S-waves, the body held straight to minimise drag. The head rides just below the surface snout forward like a periscope of nerves, reading for trouble the way a blindfolded hand reads air. A signature tremor, a school turning, a single fish darting, twitches through the water, the tail pulses, the skull angles in a low lateral snap that closes the rosette over muscle and scales. In narrower streams and flooded forests, the strategy becomes staccato, wade, feel, lunge. The dense bones help keep the torso steady. The broad feet keep the animal from sinking. The forelimbs, claws curved like hooks, assist the final pin. If a fish shears off, the tail can flip to correct. The body clips to the side and the jaws try again. It's a choreography of small decisions tuned to a medium that pushes back. The sail, once drafted as an aerodynamic stabilizer for speed, finds new roles at the water's edge. In reeds and shallows, it reads as billboard and semaphore. A dorsal display elevated above muddy banks becomes a way to talk to other Spinosaurus across tall grass and glare. Mate, rival, stranger. Thermoregulation remains plausible too. Water steals heat, and a vascularized panel offers a heatsink or radiator depending on the gradient. None of these functions need sprinting. All of them work while half submerged, patient and dangerous. Crucially, the new anatomy does not demand a single lifestyle. It allows a spectrum. Spinosaurus could stalk a sandbar, belly low like a heron scaled up to nightmare. It could slide off a bank and commit to a short, powerful swim when the gorge deepened. It could haul out to sun and digest, sail dark against an evening sky that reflected its silhouette back in ripples. The animal reads as amphibious in habit, if not in lineage. A theropod that stepped out of the land-only contract and signed a new one with rivers. Skepticism, as always, sharpened the argument. Could a theropod this large really chase prey underwater? Maybe not in the open ocean sense, but pursuit is a word with many gears. In confined channels, chase means 3 tail beats and a pivot. Could the dense bones alone explain submergence? Bone density interacts with lung volume, muscle distribution and posture. No single trait wins the debate. But the chorus, teeth, snout, nares, palate, limbs, tail, chemistry, context, sings a harmony that the land-only model cannot carry without breaking. Once you grant Spinosaurus the water, other mysteries stop being problems and become payoffs. The awkwardness on land becomes a trade. The kind evolution makes all the time. The short hind limbs aren't a flaw. They're a choice that lowers the body to the strike zone and frees the tail to do real work. The forward centre of mass isn't a mistake. It stabilises the head while the tail pushes. The strange skull isn't an affectation. It's a toolkit whose utility appears the instant you watch a fish explode into motion. And imagine what it takes to end that motion. Even behaviour finds footing in the environment implied. River margins are crowded. Crocodiles lurk. Giant fish are not passive. Other theropods prowl the banks. A specialised predator must carve its hours and places, dawn and dusk in side channels, midday in shaded cuts under overhangs, night under starlight, snout reading more than eyes. Nesting might take place on higher bars during low water. Juveniles, lighter and less capable swimmers, may spend more time in ankle-deep flats, hunting smaller prey while avoiding the deeper territories of adults. The sail becomes a signal in that social map, a way to assert space without constant combat in a medium where sound muffles and scent diffuses quickly. In the end, the river hunter isn't a single fossil, paper or eureka. It's a slow convergence that pulled a myth back to where the sediment says it belongs. It's the moment you stop asking, could a giant theropod really live like this? And start asking, why wouldn't it here? The answer runs through every channel it once patrolled. Because the water was thick with food. Because the bones it grew made the water a partner rather than an obstacle. Because evolution is opportunistic, not sentimental, and a dinosaur with the right hardware will try the door that opens. What emerged from that rethinking is not a diminished monster, but a stranger, and more elegant one. A sensor-laden snout holding court just under the meniscus. A body trimmed for neutrality against the pull of buoyancy. A tail that writes power into water with each sweep. Feet that negotiate mud like a language. A sail that speaks across the reeds. The poster on the wall goes quiet. In its place you hear the hush of a channel at dawn, and then the thrum of a tail and the sudden, decisive absence where a fish used to be. To understand this animal's life you have to slow it down and watch how it solves problems that water creates. Currents tug, mud pulls, visibility collapses to arm's length. A land sprinter turns useless in that world. Spinosaurus didn't outrun those problems. It redesigned the way a giant theropod exists. Movement became quiet, balanced, and opportunistic. A series of small adjustments that add up to mastery. Begin with posture. On land, the centre of mass sits farther forward than in other big meat-eaters, so the body rides low, hips and knees bent, tail carried as a counterpoise, but not as a rigid beam. The gait likely looked measured rather than loping. Shorter steps, a slight roll through the hips, the torso inclined so the head stays near the action, edges of pools, cut banks, riffles. Feet placed wide to keep from sinking, toes spreading in soft sediment, every step a negotiation with the ground. It isn't graceful to us because we're used to the clean geometry of a dry savanna predator. It's beautiful if you judge it by how little mud it throws. Now slide that same body into knee-deep water. The physics flip. Weight sheds into buoyancy. The tail wakes up. Those tall, flexible tail blades aren't ornaments. They're engines. The animal holds most of its trunk steady to reduce drag, then writes sideways S-curves into the river with the tail, each wave pushing water backward and the body forward. Acceleration comes from a handful of powerful strokes. Cruising is a low-amplitude flutter that barely dents the surface. The head becomes a steady platform like a camera gimbal in a documentary rig. Joints in the neck absorb the oscillations coming from behind, so the snout can hover, aim, and strike without telegraphing motion to the prey. Stability is the hidden trick. Dense limb and torso bones act like ballast, so the body doesn't bob with every swell or kick. That ballast pairs with broad, load-spreading feet that bite into the riverbed instead of ice skating on it. Where the bottom turns to soup, the animal abandons strict walking for a hybrid. A foot plants lightly, the tail contributes a nudge, and the next foot relocates to firmer purchase. A three-dimensional shuffle that never commits to a single point of failure. In deeper cuts, the feet stop mattering at all. The tail and torso take over, the legs hitching along the body to cut drag, knees tucked, toes trailing. You can almost see the decision tree. Wade when you can, float when you must, swim when it pays. Turning, for a creature this long, is not trivial. On land, a pivot is slow. You feel the mass spool up, hips rotating in segments. In water, the geometry becomes an advantage. A single powerful sweep of the tail and a slight tilt of the trunk roll the body into a banked turn, the head carving a tight arc while the hips and tail lag behind like a train taking a curve. That bank and yaw maneuver lets the animal snap toward a ripple or away from a threat in a space no dry ground theropod could manage without skidding. It's not about speed over distance, it's about rearranging your body faster than the water can reorganize around you. Breathing sets the tempo for everything. A theropod's bird-like lungs move air efficiently but aren't built for long-sealed dives. The animal plays the surface. Picture the snout riding just below the meniscus, nostrils edged back from the splash line to keep floodwater out, the top of the head angled so a shallow lift takes air. It's a predator that can feed with most of its profile hidden, the sail and upper back reading as a drift log until movement gives the game away. When it needs oxygen in a hurry, one buoyant pulse of the tail brings the mouth up without committing the whole body to the surface. Feeding technique governs movement at small scales. A fish bolts left. The jaws don't chase with big slashes. The body cheats the angle. Tail lays down 3 quick beats. The trunk preloads to the right. The head arrives where the fish will be, not where it is. If the grip misses, the forelimbs, muscular, clawed, enter as grapples in the shallows, pinning a stunned prey item against the substrate or dragging it up onto a bar. On land, those same forelimbs look overbuilt for a pure runner. In shin-deep water, they're multi-purpose tools. Anchors, brakes, levers. Energy economy explains the choreography. Moving a multi-ton frame across dry floodplain is expensive. Water pays some of that bill back if you let it carry you. So the animal's day has a tidal rhythm, even far from the sea. It will take the long path along channels rather than the shortcut over sand. It will linger in eddies where food flows past for free. It will time crossings to cooler hours when the surface water densifies ever so slightly and supports it better. These are tiny gains that compound across a lifetime. Seasonal changes remap the body plan onto different problems. In flood, when the river swells into the forest and fish disperse, movement becomes exploratory. Long, sinuous patrols through drowned thickets, tail weaving between trunks, feet testing the new floor. In drought, when channels shrink to strings of pools, patience replaces patrol. The animal posts itself at narrows and inlets, half buried in shade, making only the motions that pay. A head tilt to reduce glare, a one-beat pulse to correct drift, a short step to claim a better eddy. You can mistake such stillness for laziness until the strike erases the hour between motions. Land is never irrelevant, just less important. There are nests to place on high ground where floodwater won't reach. There are carcasses to sample when the river gifts one to the bank. There are territories to display across open spaces where the sail does its loudest work. On dry excursions, the animal reads as a low, forward-leaning biped, the tail carried off the ground, hips flexed. It can surge when it must, bursts to intimidate a rival, a fast exit from a shrinking pool. But those are exceptions you remember because they're noisy. The rule is a deliberative plod that takes care not to waste a step. Courtship and conflict exploit the vertical real estate that the sail provides. Two animals approach along opposite banks, each keeping its feet in water for stability. The tails beat slowly, almost ceremonially, to hold station against the current while the sails tilt and cant like flags seeking wind. Colour, whatever the palette was, does the talking across glare that makes eyes squint. If escalation is required, movement answers first. The larger body slides closer, using a diagonal cross of the current to demonstrate control. A faint rush throws a sheet of water that collapses over the rival's head. Bites are risky in this medium. Shoves, splashes, and possession of the best ambush lanes settle most arguments. Youngsters move differently because their problems are different. Lighter bodies don't need as much ballast to stay down. They bob more and swim more with their feet, overusing the limbs in the way apprentices overuse their hands before they learn to trust the big muscles. They stick to edges where turning radii are small, and escape routes are many. Root tangles, side sloughs, braided shallows that frustrate anything larger. As they put on mass, the tail becomes the primary engine. You can imagine a juvenile season measured in the soft skill training of water, how to hold steady in turbulence, how to read a swirl, how to turn without telegraphing. Thermal management ties to movement in obvious and sneaky ways. Water steals heat, sun returns it. Mornings invite long, lazy traverses along sunlit shallows, where the sail can warm blood while the belly stays cool. Midday hunts favour shade and depth, not just for prey activity, but to avoid overheating the big aerobic muscles that drive the tail. On cool evenings, hauling out onto a bar and angling the sail to the day's last light warms the core before the night's slower reactions begin. If you watch closely, orientation changes, left bank to right bank, up current to down current, map to the sky's shifting furnace. Predators that share the water push Spinosaurus into specific movement strategies. Crocodilians demand respect in ambush ranges. Giant fish can injure with a flail. Other theropods own the bank. The answer is zoning. In broad daylight, stick to zones where a burst of tail power makes collision unlikely. Wide shallows, pool margins with clean sight lines. At night, nose deeper into side channels where the pressure sense in the snout outperforms rivals' eyes. On crowded bends, yield the apex spot briefly, then re-enter on a line that uses current to deliver you sideways and frictionless into the vacancy without a fight. The body is not just a machine here, it's a passport that gets stamped at many borders. Even resting has a mechanics. On land, the animal chooses a slight slope with the head downhill, so standing again requires less lift. The tail arcs along the contour like a brace that never quite touches. In water, rest is an art of partial commitment. Belly on a submerged bar, feet light, tail idle but cocked to answer drift, jaw tipped so the nostrils are one easy nod from air. True sleep likely comes in short watches, the way modern aquatic hunters nap, alternating vigilance between senses, one set of muscles holding a quiet line while another goes off duty. If you zoom out from a single day to a lifetime, the movement maps coalesce into routes. There are traditional crossings where the bottom holds, seasonal detours that open only in flood, secret wintering pools that keep oxygen when others go anoxic. A successful adult knows them the way a shepherd knows pastures. It doesn't migrate across continents. It commutes intelligently within a river empire, accepting a little land slog to thread two productive reaches and avoiding the vanity of straight lines. Everything about this animal's motion says trade. Give up the high gear sprint that wins chases on land, gain the fine control that wins ambushes in water, sacrifice the visual charisma of a dry ground tyrant, gain the subtle authority of a creature that can place its skull exactly where a fish will be 2 heartbeats from now. Once you see those trades, the body's oddities stop looking odd. Shorter legs are not mistakes. They lower the working end of the predator into the strike zone and reduce torque when the tail is doing real work. The big sail isn't a speed fin, it's a billboard, a radiator, a stabilizer in cross currents. Dense bones aren't dead weight. They're the price of not being yanked around by buoyancy every time you move. In motion, then, Spinosaurus doesn't resemble the superhero silhouette we grew up with. It resembles a thesis about how to be enormous in a medium that punishes clumsy giants. Where land tyrants used distance and momentum, this one used proximity and poise. Where they telegraphed power in long strides, it whispered it in the hush between tail beats. And where we once imagined thundering runs over dunes, the real drama plays out in near silence. A low glide through tea-coloured water, a shadow sliding past reeds, the single, sudden decision that turns a ripple into a meal. Being wrong isn't a detour in science, it's the road itself. Spinosaurus makes that visible in a way few creatures can, because our first picture was so confident and so compelling, and because the correction felt like a plot twist. We didn't just replace one poster with another, we learned, in public, how to treat our best ideas as drafts. That matters far beyond dinosaurs. It teaches how knowledge grows, not by stacking certainties, but by pruning good guesses until what remains can stand on its own. The first payoff of being wrong is humility with teeth. It's easy to say, science changes. It's harder to live inside change when it topples an animal you've drawn the same way since childhood. Spinosaurus forced that confrontation. When the new tail, bone density and snout evidence arrived, researchers had a choice. Defend the old sprinting giant or let the data move the silhouette. The discipline chose the latter. That choice trains a reflex we need everywhere. Loyalty to methods, not to models. You can admire a beautiful hypothesis and still send it to the shredder when a better explanation walks in dripping river water. Being wrong also exposes the invisible scaffolding that holds our inferences up. We discovered, the hard way, how much weight we had put on a destroyed holotype, on second-hand measurements, on cousins standing in for missing anatomy. That reckoning led to practices that outlive any single dinosaur. High-resolution archiving, redundant storage across institutions, 3D scanning of fragile specimens, exhaustive provenance tracking, and open data so that the next bomb, literal or metaphorical, does less damage. Every "we can't check that anymore" becomes motivation to make sure future scientists can. Error is a brilliant cartographer of our cognitive biases. With Spinosaurus you can watch anchoring work in real time. The first popular reconstruction set a boundary, and later ones orbited that outline like satellites. Confirmation bias followed, rewarding any observation that flattered the land predator idea and discounting those that didn't. Even aesthetic bias had a vote. Our eyes preferred the clean hero pose of a dune sprinter to the awkward pragmatism of a wader. Naming those habits is not self-flagellation, it's quality control. Once you can point to the tricks your brain tries to play, you can design against them. Blind analyses, multiple working hypotheses, pre-registered predictions and deliberate attempts to break your own favourite model before the world does. The Spinosaurus revision shows why converging lines of evidence beat any single spectacular find. No one trait, the conical teeth, the backset nares, the dense bone, the paddle-like tail, would have carried the case alone. Together they sing in harmony. That's the template we want for other debates. Anatomy in dialogue with geochemistry, biomechanics with sedimentology, histology with phylogeny. The method that corrected Spinosaurus is a portable toolkit you can use to weigh claims about any organism or system that can't walk into a lab on command. Being wrong changes the questions we think to ask. The land tyrant myth made "how fast could it run" feel like the obvious question. The river hunter model swaps in better ones. How did it manage buoyancy? What velocities can that tail produce? Where do fish aggregate in this formation season by season? Those questions pull new data into view. Isotope baselines, flow models of ancient channels, microwear on teeth from slippery prey. In other words, a correction doesn't just fix an answer, it widens the answerable. There's a cultural dividend too. We often talk to the public as if uncertainty were a flaw, something to apologise for at the end of a talk. Spinosaurus gives us a chance to showcase uncertainty as an engine. The message isn't, "We were mistaken, sorry, but we improved, here's how." You can point to old art and new scans, to competing reconstructions annotated with evidence weights, to timelines that show when and why interpretation shifted. That kind of transparency doesn't erode trust. It earns it, because it invites people into the process rather than asking for faith in the product. Ethically, the case sharpened our view of provenance. When the holotype is gone and formations are complex, context becomes non-negotiable. A beautiful bone without a trustworthy label can be more confusing than helpful. Spinosaurus sits in a region where commercial collecting, mixed deposits, and long supply chains make context fragile. The lesson is not ban everything, it's attach the story to the specimen like a second skeleton. GPS, stratigraphic logs, photographed field relationships, and prompt accession into public collections. All of it makes future corrections faster and safer. Being wrong also shifts how we imagine ecosystems. The sprinting desert killer version of Spinosaurus encouraged copy-paste thinking about big theropods. Different heads, same jobs. The river hunter breaks that monotony. Suddenly, niche specialization floods the frame. Dinosaurs partitioning space and time the way modern predators do, with waterlines as real borders. Once you expect specialization, you go looking for it in other lineages and time slices, and you find it, because evolution loves trade-offs more than archetypes. There is a pedagogical gift, and it's huge. Students learn quickly that facts can collapse, so they often ask, with a mix of fear and wonder, what they're supposed to hold on to. Spinosaurus provides a clean answer. Hold on to procedures. Learn to count the kinds of evidence in play. Learn to compute how each would look if the hypothesis were true and if it were false. Learn to read the difference between a bold inference and a fragile leap. What sticks isn't the current picture of one animal, it's the habit of testing pictures until they wobble or lock. On the technical side, the revision accelerated method development. If you want to argue about swimming, you need better hydrodynamic models for extinct animals. If you want to talk bone density and buoyancy, you need comparative data sets across extant semi-aquatic species. If you want to understand foraging, you need isotope baselines calibrated to the actual paleo river chemistry, not just modern analogues. Each of those investments pays off everywhere else in paleontology and deep time ecology. Spinosaurus was the squeaky wheel that got the grease. The entire cart rolls smoother. Being wrong in a high-profile case also pressure tests scientific culture. Can colleagues publish a sharp correction without it being read as a feud? Can journals make space for revisions as exciting as first descriptions? Can museums update exhibits and say proudly, "We changed this because we learned more"? The better we get at those behaviours, the faster our collective error correction loop spins. That's not just good optics. It's survival gear in a century where misinformation moves faster than peer review. There's a quieter, almost philosophical gain. Compassion for complexity. The river, the animal, the rock record, and our minds all have currents. Some days the evidence is clear and laminar. Some days it eddies. Accepting that texture keeps you from forcing tidy answers where none are warranted. It also keeps you curious when a detail won't fit. A misplaced groove on a bone, a chemical ratio that refuses to round to the nearest story, those become invitations rather than irritants. Spinosaurus trained us to follow irritants into insights. Importantly, the wrongness here wasn't sin, it was stage. We did the best we could with what we had, then we did better when we had more. That frame rescues scientists from perfectionism and the public from cynicism. It tells a kinder, truer story. Progress is a relay race, not a single runner breaking the tape. Stromer's careful notes handed the baton to later teams. New fieldwork handed it to modelling. Modelling passed it to histology, and so on. The finish line keeps moving because the course is the horizon. And if you need one more reason that being wrong matters, it makes the world bigger again. The sprinting dune monster was fun but familiar. The river shadow with a sensor-studded snout and a tail that writes power into water is stranger, richer, more specific to its place and time. In correcting ourselves, we didn't shrink Spinosaurus, we let it be itself. That is the whole point of studying the past, to meet minds and bodies that evolution actually made, not the ones we would have designed. So the moral is not, don't be wrong. You will be. The moral is, be wrong in ways that can be made right. Archive the evidence. Say out loud what would change your mind. Build models that advertise their assumptions. Teach the updates as proudly as the discoveries. Then, when the next fossil whispers from the matrix that your favourite silhouette is off by a mile, you'll know what to do. You'll pick up the eraser, not as an admission of defeat, but as the tool that turns a sketch into a portrait. For 100 years we chased a desert phantom, long legs, roaring jaws, a sail like a war banner. Then the river spoke. Piece by piece, the bones and the rock and the chemistry pulled us to the water's edge and asked us to look again. Not a sprinter over dunes, but a shadow in the shallows. Not steak knives, but grip and hold. Not a balancing pole, but a tail that writes power into water. The poster came down. The animal stepped out. That reversal isn't an embarrassment. It's the proof that this works. Science draws in pencil on purpose. We test an outline until it smudges, then redraw it closer to the living thing that once moved, hunted, and slept under another sky. Spinosaurus reminds us that the past isn't fixed in glass cases. It changes as our questions sharpen and our tools improve. And the story isn't finished. Somewhere in the stone there's a joint we haven't found, a trace we haven't read, a detail that will force one more correction. Good. Let it. If we could be so certain and still be so wrong, imagine how much wonder is still waiting upstream. So keep your mind in draft, your curiosity on the surface, and your ears tuned to the quiet. In the hush before dawn, a tale beats once, twice, and the river gives up another secret.